there's really no objective definition of motivational interviewing. So I wanted to construct a definition together. And I reached out to a couple of behavior analysts and I said, how do we make this as objective as possible? How do we make it so it also underlines the main characteristics? And I came up with my own definition of motivational interviewing. Motivational interviewing is the intentional arrangement through timing, tone, and type of verbal contingencies designed to evoke, differentially reinforce, strengthen, and generalize change talk. Today is one of my favorite episodes, and I'll tell you guys why. As a behavior analyst, I love conceptualizing different theoretical and other kind of constructs and concepts in ABA terminology, just because I think that in order for us to use some of these concepts that are out there that do have this empirical research, we have to objectively define it. And we also have to understand it from a more objective way. That's why this session or this episode, I wanted to go over this article, which was one of my first articles, one of the first articles that I used that made me interested in moving this motivational interviewing, strategy, communication techniques, moving it into the ABA world. Because first, I know that this is something that we as behavior analysts need when we're working with parents. Sometimes we're not getting that buy-in, we're not building that rapport. So when I started my practicum session with substance use disorder, I saw how wonderfully motivational interviewing worked. And I said, hey, I have to bring it into our field. It just makes sense. So this is a way to bridge both fields. And this article by Michael Doerr and by Paulette Christopher was one of the first articles that I read. And I was like, wow, this makes so much sense. If this article is available out there, I'll also put the link in the summary of this episode so you guys can take a look at it and find it. And it's really interesting because it conceptualizes a lot of these motivational interviewing terms into ways where we can objectively define it and see it. I love doing that again. And I have some courses in my library and my academy, which are CEUs for like DSM, for example, the DSM technical terms, how to conceptually define it into ABA terminology. So I always find it interesting, and I hope that you guys find it interesting too. So again, the article we're going to be going over today, and I have it here, so I'll be taking a look at it as I'm speaking with you, because I'm going to be directly quoting it, is a behavior analytical account of motivational interviewing. All right. So I just came back from ABAI. I went to Portugal, beautiful Portugal. And I did my talk there. And before I started my talk, I said, you know what? There's really no objective definition of motivational interviewing. So I wanted to construct a definition together. And I reached out to a couple of behavior analysts and I said, how do we make this as objective as possible? How do we make it so it also underlines the main characteristics? And I came up with my own definition of motivational interviewing. Motivational interviewing is the intentional arrangement through timing, tone, and type of verbal contingencies designed to evoke, differentially reinforce, strengthen, and generalize change talk. Now, I love this definition because MI is intentional. So it contains soft skills that allow us to engage with others, and that's great. But if there's no intention behind that, then we're really not going anywhere. So we don't want to stay paralyzed and just have a great communication and build a great rapport. We also want to move people towards change. So motivational interviewing has that intentional piece to it. Every verbal operant or every type of soft skill or OARS skill that we use has to be geared towards a goal, a shared goal with the client. Timing, tone, and type of verbal contingencies are really important too. There's certain ORs that you will use here or there, open-ended questions, you'll use them for different purposes depending on the four processes of motivational interviewing. If you're interested in learning about that, take a look at my previous episodes where I go over the ORs and how to use them in the four different processes of motivational interviewing. And then it's designed to evoke, differentially reinforce, strengthen, and generalize change talk. Differentially reinforce. And I think that's a very good technique. And it really explains what we do when we are in front of sustained talk or when we are in front of change talk. We either give it attention or we ignore it, which is what differentially reinforcing is, right? We reinforce a behavior while putting the other one on extinction. And that's exactly what we do with change talk and sustained talk. All right. So that is my definition. If you guys have a better way of tweaking this definition, I'm always open to hear from you. Put it in the comments, send me an email, let me know. So the first thing that we're going to conceptualize here in this article is MI as a behavior strategy. So the way that the authors pose it is that MI reduces punishment and confrontation, lowering avoidance. The therapist differentially reinforces client verbal behavior about contingencies. This evoked verbal behavior becomes self mands that later guide behavior. So I think that's very interesting in the way that they conceptualize it. And also, they define MI as a therapeutic environment. So it's not only a technique, it's not only about communication, but it's about setting the environment so to make it more likely that certain behaviors will happen. We know that those are things that we can in some way arrange. We can't really change behavior, but we can arrange the environment where behavior changes. All right. The other term is intrinsic motivation. So, how do we objectively define intrinsic motivation? So, automatically reinforced behaviors. So, behaviors maintained by their own sensory or natural consequences, not by social or external rewards. Again, we want the change to stick. We don't just want to come in and speak with the parents and have a session with the parent, and it sounds great and they're doing it to get our praise, and they're doing it to show off, hey, look, I'm using these techniques, give me praise. We want it also to become intrinsic, because that is how we know that we can then leave, that we can then say, okay, we're ready to fade out sessions because you got this and you've maintained this and you're generalizing it as well. So we want it to become that intrinsic motivation. Ambivalence. So, ambivalence is defined as competing contingencies controlling a single behavior. So, MI treats ambivalence as contacting conflicting reinforcers or punishers about behavior change. Think about ambivalence and what it means. Ambivalence is wanting one thing and simultaneously wanting another at the same time. So, I'm really tired today. I want to go to the gym. I want to work out. At the same time, I also want to rest. So it's having this simultaneous feelings that are contradicting, but they exist in the same moment. And again, if we are pulling this, it's going to pop and then we're going to feel paralyzed in the middle. So that's not what we want to do, right? That's not as clinicians what we want to do. What we want to do is explore that ambivalence. And the authors they explain exploring ambivalence as prompting the client to tact both sides of the contingency. When we are using reflections, reflections can function as text or as mands, depending on the answer, the response that we're getting from the client. But most of the time, it helps with exploring this ambivalence, and it prompts the client to tact both sides. So these are some reasons why I want to go to the gym. These are some reasons why I want to stay and chill or relax. The other part of exploring ambivalence is that, and this is more of that technical or intention piece to motivational interviewing. As a clinician, as a strategic MI professional, you want to develop discrepancies. Developing discrepancies is defined as arranging a verbal environment in which the client contacts the mismatch between what they want and what they're doing. So, these short term goals that we have and these long term goals that we have. So, if I look at my example, it's like, okay, well, my long term goals is that I want to go to the gym 4 times a week. And now I've only gone to the gym 3 times a week. So if I go to the gym, I am closer to that. So it's sort of like, starting to think about that, and the clinician, the questions they ask, the reflections they make can help develop some of these discrepancies. So I'm like, yeah, I see that there's a big discrepancy with what I want to do, which is relax, and my ultimate goal, which is go to the gym 4 times a week. Another concept that is also defined in this article is the MI spirit. So, the MI spirit has to do with collaboration, with partnership, with evocation, and also with accepting the client's autonomy. So, those are the main tenets of it. So, the MI spirit can function as an autoclitic. And just as a reminder, autoclitic is a type of verbal behavior that modifies the meaning strength or the listener impact of the verbal behavior of the rest of the conversation that the clinician will be having with the client. So it changes how another verbal operant functions, in other words. So one thing that is mentioned here in this article when they talk about collaboration, it's collaboration is establishing a non-punitive environment that reduces counterpliance and increases client control verbal behavior. I love that word of counterpliance. It sounds a little bit like compliance. I know that in our field we're a little where, whenever we hear compliance, we kind of have this physiological reaction where we jump because of everything that has been tied to that. But I think I like this definition of non-punitive environment, reducing counterpliance and subsequently increasing client control verbal behavior. What do you guys think about this? I'm curious to know. All right, evocation. So therapist behavior that establishes motivating operations for client change talk to occur and be reinforced. So again, evocation, we are asking the right questions. We're setting it up. So we are establishing those MOs for client change talk to occur. Autonomy, they define it as acknowledging the client's choice, enhancing rule governed behavior controlled by personal values, not therapist directives. So the MI spirit doesn't change what the therapist says, it changes the function of what the therapist says. So again, we want to carry the spirit in all of our interactions. The spirit is not just something that we check off and we move on, but it's what puts everything together. I heard about this metaphor and I thought it was so strong. And it was like the spirit of motivational interviewing is the sound. When you hear a song, the lyrics are the actual skills that we are using. And then the sound behind it is the spirit. And that's how it should be used. The spirit is always carried through all of our conversation. And the MI spirit is the tone that makes everything you say land better. That's basically what it is. That's why it's so similar to autoclitics. All right, let's talk about the OARS because the OARS are these main skills that we all talk about in motivational interviewing. So when we look at open-ended questions, these can be seen as mands. We're manding for that information. So, evoking very varied verbal responses, increasing response variability. So, this is how the authors explain it or the way that they define it in their article. And I wanted to use this motivational interviewing deck cards to give you guys some examples because I feel like a lot of the times I talk about these things, but without examples, you can't see it come alive. And some of you are looking at me, so maybe that helps. But if you're just listening, you're not using your other senses. And I think that learning involves using all other senses, like all of your senses. So this is my motivational interviewing deck card set. And here I have open-ended questions, I have affirmations, and I also have reflections. So by the way, obviously you wouldn't use this in front of the client while you're speaking with them. That would be a little strange, but what some therapists have told me is that they use this as a cheat sheet in their car before they go into the session. Or if they're doing telehealth, they use it right before the parent training session. So let me read the first open ended question here. What is one manageable, realistic change you could initiate that could potentially lead to better and bigger transformations over time? So this is number 29. And as you can see, we are manding. We are manding for that information. We're evoking that motivation within the client. Another one is, if things keep going the way they are now, what is the best case scenario? How about the flip side? So right here, we're kind of evoking some sustained talk because we talk about the best case scenario. And again, when parents are ambivalent about an intervention, it is because not intervening in their child's behavior also has value. So they're getting something from not intervening, but they're also going to get something from intervening. So that's what we want to focus on. The next part of this question is, how about the flip side? And this allows the parent to then look at the flip side. This is another one. What are some advantages of changing the way you intervene in your child's behavior? So what are some advantages that you can think about right now? And again, this allows a parent to brainstorm. It allows them to start thinking about these things that probably they weren't thinking before because they weren't even thinking of intervening. They weren't even thinking of changing. So when you ask that question, automatically you're mandating that. All right, so let's move on to affirmations. So, affirmations can be seen as condition reinforcers and social reinforcement for adaptive statements, especially change talk. So, this is how the authors conceptualize affirmations. Here are some examples of affirmations. It's okay to question the effectiveness of certain strategies. Exploring options with a critical eye can lead to a better understanding of your child's needs. So, again, we are allowing the parent, and this may not be a super strong affirmation, but I love in that you are siding with the parent and you're also indirectly reinforcing that they are giving it a critical eye. Don't we need them to have a critical eye? Absolutely. We don't want them to come back to session and say, oh, I just learned about this special blanket that, takes away all the behaviors associated or the symptoms of autism. We don't want them to just kind of go on the internet and just drink up everything that everyone tells them. We want them to have a skeptical eye. That's important. Here's another affirmation. It can be tough to stand firm at it, and it takes a lot of willpower to do what you are doing. So again, it's really tough for you to stand firm. Again, it takes a lot of willpower to do what you are doing. So we're affirming strengths. And again, when we do this, there has to be data involved. You don't want to say this to a parent that is not showing you this. Here's another affirmation. Every time you strive for consistency, you're making a positive impact on your child's life. So, again, we are reinforcing consistency. And every time that you're doing, this is a result. So, these are some affirmations that can be used. I just randomly picked them. So, perhaps they're not my strongest affirmations, but I think they're good ones. Let's go into reflections. So, reflections can be tax, can be mands. It really depends on what the parent responds. That's how it kind of makes it a tact or mand. These are defined as all reflections or mands and introverbals designed to evoke additional verbal behavior. They shape verbal behavior about contingencies. So this is how they define it in this article. So I can see how it can also be introverbals. I've also or only have I was thinking about them as tax or mans, but obviously it can also be introverbals. So here are some examples of reflections again taken from my deck card. It seems like you and let's say it's the other child's parent, have different views on this issue, which can be challenging. It's great that you're all invested in what's best for your child. How might you find common ground to work together for their benefit? So here we have a reflection followed by an affirmation and then a question as well. Here's another reflection. It's understandable to be concerned about your child's treatment by their teacher. How do you think you and the teacher could work together to improve things for your child at school? So, again, this is a reflection followed by a question. I included questions here just because it's hard to give not a recommendation, but it's difficult to just give a reflection as a cheat sheet when it's not based on a conversation, it's not based on something a parent said. And I wanted this to just be focused on the therapist's point of view and not the parent. Here's another one. On one hand, you're unsure that this will work, and on the other hand, you want things to improve. what do you think you need to feel more confident about this process? So that one hand and the other hand is called a double reflection. So this is a more complex reflection, but it definitely works because more so for parents that are in this ambivalent stage, you're pointing out the ambivalence and you're saying, hey, it's okay. I see it. Let's talk about it. Let's not have this pink elephant in the room. So the authors define the simple reflections as pure repetition, demonstrates understanding, functions as an autoclitic. Complex reflection specifies contingencies more precisely, evokes deeper tacting. Amplified reflection are purposefully exaggerated to reduce counterpliance and evoke correction. And double sided reflection, just like the one I just read to you guys, presents both contingency sets, change versus status quo, to establish discrepancy. And then finally, we have summaries. So, summaries are a combination of tax, mands, and generalization. So, an extended tact of full contingency landscape, arranging competing consequences clearly. So, this is a part where this is what the authors define it as. Let's move on to change talk and sustain talk. So, change talk is defined as client verbal behavior that identifies appetitive consequences for change. And sustained talk are verbal behavior that identifies appetitive or escape maintain consequences of not changing. So MI differentially reinforces change talk, and certain therapist behaviors evoke specific client verbal operants. So depending on the question that we ask, we will either get a lot of sustained talk or a lot of change talk during our sessions. When we talk about differentially reinforcing the reinforcement in MI, the article defines it as MI explicitly uses DR of verbal behavior. They reinforce change talk. They do not reinforce sustained talk. So that's something that we already spoke about. And this is really one of the strongest ABA parallels in this article. When I first read this article, I was like, wow, this is actually using one of the strategies that we use in motivational interviewing, which in MI, it's not called this way, but we also use it in ABA all the time. So I found it to be very interesting. And when I've spoken with my colleagues that are just in the MI world, not in the ABA world, and I mention differentially reinforcement and I tell them what this procedure is, they're like, oh my gosh, yeah, this makes so much sense. We never even thought about it like that. But when you're in both worlds, you can see things, right, together. Self-mands, when a client verbally commits, I will. Public rule statements, self-mands that increase the probability of following the rule later. So these are self-mands to commitment. Um, and then finally, they talk about rule governed behavior. So many client statements imply rules. If I drink, I can relax. MI weakens maladaptive rules, strengthens adaptive ones, and evokes more accurate tacting of actual contingencies. So the main, I think, takeaway of all of this is carrying the spirit of motivational interviewing with everything you do. Also, thinking about the intention behind your words and the goal that you have in mind during the session. Because it's not just using the OARS and then calling it a day and having this great relationship with the client. We also want them to move towards change. So we need that strategic piece as well. So, just something to keep in mind. And if you have any questions or if you want me or suggest any corrections into any of these definitions, please put them in the comments. I always like to just have conversations about this with other analysts. You may see things that I'm not seeing, but I hope that this helped in objectively defining some of these motivational interviewing terms. I think there's still room to conceptualize in a more objective way these other terms in MI. And definitely, I'll be doing more of that. But I hope, as always, that you found value in this session. Until next episode. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of MI for Change. If you're ready to keep growing your motivational interviewing skills, I'd love to invite you to explore my MI Academy, where you'll find a full library of on-demand courses designed to help you put MI into practice with confidence. You can learn more at www.drmonicagilbert.com. Until next time, keep asking the questions that spark change.